presentation is based on a paper I wrote last fall, in which I make the case for dance as a form of critical thinking. And the thrust of my argument was to encourage us as educators not to underestimate or undersell the intellectual value of dancing, even as we claim all the other amazing things that it does. That sometimes the intrinsically intellectual piece seems to kind of get left out of the conversation. So I believe that embodied practices can be classified as modes of thinking in and of themselves, and that we need not abdicate critical thinking skills to the sciences and the humanities. This is something we do all the time as dancers. So I'm going to try to summarize the ideas from this paper and then tell you a little bit about how I applied these ideas to a couple of undergraduate ballet classes I was teaching at the University of Washington, and then share some thoughts for kind of where I see this going next. And hope we'll have a little time for me to hear from you as well. So just a little bit about my perspective, where I'm coming from. Again, I'm speaking mostly to my experience as someone who teaches undergraduates, but I think a lot of these ideas can really be applicable to students and teachers of any age. And the other note is that the other part of my work that contributes a lot to kind of what I'm thinking about is my work as an Alexander technique teacher, and sort of my ongoing interest in how we can use somatics to support our dance teaching and dance teaching to support somatics, so both of those things. So I'm really glad to be here. Thank you all for being here. We only have 30 minutes, but I'm around all weekend. So feel free to get in touch. I'd love to nerd out and talk about any of these ideas with you. So I thought we'd start by doing a little critical thinking exercise ourselves. So I'm just going to give you like 30 seconds, 45 seconds to kind of think about what you might define critical thinking as. You can just think, or you can write notes, and I'm just going to have you share with your neighbor, but I'll give you 30 seconds or so to think about what critical thinking might mean to you. Whenever you're ready, if you just want to turn to a neighbor and share what you came up with.
Yeah, I mean, I think, but yeah, so those are questions yeah, there's something yeah, well, first like observing what's going on.
Okay, got something? Got some things? Thanks. So I'm probably guessing that each of us had a different idea of what critical thinking was, which is fine. But I kind of got started on this paper because critical thinking seemed to be kind of a buzzword that was coming up, has been coming up throughout my whole American liberal arts education as this sort of assumed value that we're all getting out of our education. And it occurred to me it might be in our best interest to kind of have a sense of what we mean, and some collective sense of what we mean when we're talking about critical thinking. So it turns out there was, in the course of my research, I came across a study that was done that polled professors from 38 public and 28 private colleges here in the state of California, and found that the overwhelming majority of teachers claimed, 89%, claimed that critical thinking was a primary objective of their instruction. But only 19% could give a clear explanation for what that was. And only 9% were found to be clearly teaching for critical thinking on any given day in a classroom. So this was interesting. So I kind of set out to figure out what people were saying about critical thinking. So I'll share with you a couple of the definitions that I found from other people. So they really ranged, and here's one that's kind of vague and verbose, but this is the definition of critical thinking. The intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, and or evaluating information based on universal intellectual values that transcend subject matter divisions: clarity, accuracy, precision, consistency, relevance, sound evidence, good reasons, depth, breadth, and fairness. Yeah. Others were really simplistic and terse, like critical thinking is the objective analysis of facts to form a judgment. And some were even cheeky. Critical thinking is thinking about your thinking while you're thinking to make your thinking better. So as different as all the definitions were that I found, I did find some kind of common themes, so I wanted to share those with you. This over here. So the first was that people talk about critical thinking as being inquiry-based, or starting with, involving some kind of a problem, starting with a problem. They talk about it being inherently self-reflective, so it acknowledges the biases and assumptions of the thinker. It's process-oriented, meaning that it values the journey of thinking over the end product or the right answer. It's comprehensive in that it aims to come at the issue from multiple angles and perspectives. It's active and participatory, meaning it's not just receptive, kind of receiving of information in this sort of top-down way. In theory, it's transferable, so we can take our critical thinking skills and apply them to any discipline or any situation, any problem that we're tasked with. It seeks new knowledge, so again, rather than the regurgitation of old information, it seeks original new ideas to be generated out of this process. And that it's purposeful, so it has some meaning to the person engaging in it. The thinker has some skin in the game. And another recent article suggested that schools are now more than ever doubling down on promises to teach these things, to teach critical thinking, as more and more of our learning comes to incorporate technology. So educators are holding critical thinking out as a skill that can't be taught by computers, and using it as an argument for why we still need humans in classrooms. So it occurs to me that these skills are not just about they're not just skills for making good thinkers, but they're skills for making good dancers. And I'm guessing that a lot of us in the room can agree that these are all things we would like to see happening in our dance classrooms. And all things that dance is really good at teaching in a very practical and applicable way all the time. So I kind of got curious about why this word critical thinking had been kind of co-opted and had kind of traveled into the upper recesses of the mind and to be seen as this cognitive phenomenon when it's something I think we do all the time in action. And then it becomes even more curious when we look at the history of some of where these ideas come from. So the origins of critical thinking can be often traced back to the Socratic dialogues, and the way in which inquiry and questioning and reflective reasoning and the challenging of commonly accepted beliefs in the context of lively conversation became kind of a new standard for how knowledge was generated and disseminated. So that was a long time ago, Socrates, right? And we can trace a lot of these ideas forward through the history of education with interesting twists and turns when we consider ideas of the Cartesian mind-body split and what happened with the separation of art and science and all the rise and fall of empires and all the class revolutions, all these interesting things. But it very distinctly picks back up again with the work in considering modern education, with the work of John Dewey He's often called the father of progressive education, and he's largely credited with drawing forward this legacy of active, engaged thinking into the establishment and into and kind of establishing these ideas as common progressive educational values. And when we think about critical thinking as an American liberal arts education value, we can really think of attributing that to John Dewey. So he was working in the early to mid 20th century at Columbia University, largely in New York. He had a lot to say about thinking, and one of his most famous texts is called Thinking as Experience. And he states that thinking itself arises from experimentation and to what he calls trying and undergoing. So he really believed that thinking arose only through experience, was an inherently reflective process, and that it was only an experience that any theory has vital significance. So in other words, just sitting on your bum and thinking about something to Dewey couldn't be considered thinking. He used the model of the scientific model to explain what he meant by thinking in this sort of process. So that the old, I did this in like elementary school science class, right? There's a problem that you encounter, you come up with a hypothesis for what might be going on, you make observations, you devise an experiment, you observe what happened, and then you draw a conclusion, and the whole cycle kind of begins again. So what this cycle might look like relative to thinking, and we could think about it, we could consider kind of in our minds here, a dance classroom as well, right? That a problem or a task presents itself, right? This situation is observed. We gather evidence and consider it in the context of who we are as thinkers or as movers. The potential implications and consequences of your proposed outcome are assessed, and some kind of conclusion is drawn, and the kind of cycle begins again. So this is pretty radical for Dewey to be saying that a person must really engage with this activity, not just with their mind, but with their whole person. It was radical for his time, and it's, I think, radical still for our time. So for the remainder of this talk, as I talk about critical thinking, I want us to really consider it as critical thinking as an activity of the whole person, not just of the mind. So I was talking with friends of mine in preparation for this talk and saying, we really just need a different word. Because the minute we say critical thinking, we go right up here. And so Alex was suggesting like body and thinking makes thinking. But that didn't sound quite right. And then I was thinking of embodied critical thinking, but that sounded kind of ponderous and clunky. And someone else suggested percepting. Any thoughts of what we want to call it? Or we can just do, if I do thinking, you know what I'm talking about? Yeah. So thinking, this means whole body experience thinking. Right? So a woman named Margaret, Margaret Dubler, totally got what Dewey was after and picked up on this. And for those of you who aren't familiar with her, she was the basketball coach at the University of Wisconsin in the early 20th century, and her boss tasked her to go to New York City and find some kind of dance worthy of a college woman's time. So she went to New York City. Thankfully, she came across John Dewey, and she found that, quote, that Dewey's inductive method of knowledge acquisition to be precisely how understanding proceeds in dance. So she immediately saw that this is what we do in dance. And she went back to Wisconsin to start the nation's first university dance class, and is largely credited with transforming dance from this sort of questionable social practice outside the institution to a valued part of our educational system. So I would argue that while it's true dance has, that's why we're all here, right? Dance has to some degree found a valued place in our educational system, but at least from my experience in higher education, that value tends to be part of what we now consider to be a well-rounded person. So that you have some kind of measure of creativity and physical activity, or physical skill as part of your kind of wheelhouse of education, but that that dance tends to be exiled still from the intellectual life on campus. That's changing a little bit, but it still seems to be sort of a separation So it's an unfortunate kind of growing apart of dance and intellect, from what I can tell, given that their sort of common root in these ideas. And it becomes even more interesting when we consider another little fact about Dewey that's not often known, but that he himself was deeply devoted to embodied practice. And in fact, he was a student of Alexander himself, F.M. Alexander, who created the Alexander technique. He took lessons from Alexander and was so taken with their work together that he wrote the introduction to 3 of Alexander's 5 books. And perhaps he found Alexander found a kinship in that Alexander also used the scientific method to explain how he engaged with the problem of psychophysical habit. He wrote a whole book about it. Dewey said that through the Alexander technique, he found things which he had known in a theoretical sense changed into vital experiences which gave new meaning to his knowledge of them. And on his 80th birthday, he gave an interview where he actually said that my theories of mind-body required contact with the work of Alexander to transform them into realities. It's a pretty strong statement, and one that, again, tends to get kind of left out of a lot of scholarship we read about Dewey. So I bring this up not necessarily as a plug for the Alexander technique, but I mean, I think Alexander is one of many somatic practices that does this really well. But to make the point that over 100 years ago, John Dewey was telling us with his words and showing us with his actions, with his own experience, that thinking itself requires a physical experience to be called thinking. So, thinking. Yeah. So this idea got me super excited, and I, for a few reasons, I wanted to kind of just share 3 reasons. One was that the implications for thinking on the transferability of dance skills into other disciplines. So in theory, if we're teaching thinking in our dance classes, then our students can be taking those skills and applying them elsewhere on campus, whatever else they're doing. And I think this presents, from a higher education perspective, an exciting opportunity for cross-departmental work on an intellectual level, which would be cool. It seems like a new kind of link. So that's one. And then 2, thinking gave me a new way of conceiving of the link between dance and somatics. So because in that somatic practices themselves tend to have a framework for inquiry kind of built into their material. And it's often better articulated, or at least more formally or explicitly articulated than some of the methods we have in dance, I think. At least how I see somatics often taught in college dance departments is relative to helping us find a more articulate skeleton and helping us have more awareness of our sensory environment, and all these wonderful, wonderful things. But I also think that there's an intellectual piece insofar as there's this framework for inquiry that's built into the material and kind of ready-made and very easily transferable into a dance classroom. So I thought that was kind of an interesting connection there between dance and somatics. I found exciting pedagogical implications in this thinking idea. As one of my personal goals as a teacher is to help my students develop agency in the classroom. Rather than me teaching material and then them just successfully regurgitating it. I would love for their learning to come out of the process of understanding what they're doing, caring about what they're doing, and making their own choices about what they're doing. So it's really theirs and it's not mine. So in my classes, I'm interested in shifting the paradigm away from, especially in teaching of technique, which is hard, right? Away from questions of right and wrong and good and bad, and into this realm of the why and the how of dancing. So the why and the purpose. Yeah. So I was very emboldened by my ideas, and so I decided to set up, I got very industrious with my ballet. I was teaching a ballet 100 beginner and a ballet 200 intermediate class in the spring. So I came up with a couple ideas of 2 projects of how I was going to get my students to really practice thinking in the classroom. So I want to tell you right away that for all my good intentions, they were not entirely successful. So maybe you'll figure it out as I tell you about it more quickly than I did. But I had very good intentions, yeah. So So the first project was that I mandated that every student once a term had an observation day where they sat out and watched the class instead of participating in it. And I gave them this form to fill out that asked them questions like, what kind of qualities made you want to watch particular dancers? Did you see your fellow dancers changing over the course of the class? And if so, what do you think contributed to those shifts happening? Could you tell what people were thinking or intending just by watching them move? What did you notice about dancers when they weren't dancing, when they were standing on the side, how they were relating to others, their body language? What did you learn from watching class that you didn't learn from taking class? I was very excited about it. And then secondly, I incorporated a project based on Swan Lake into our technique class. So, and it was based on sort of this idea of multiple intelligences. And so we went and watched Pacific Northwest Ballet do Swan Lake. And then we learned some of the variations, black and white and swan in our class. And we talked about the polarities of black and white and how these qualities showed up and were expressed in movement. And we talked about the idea of fairy tales and princes and princesses, and if these sort of archetypes still had a place in our culture, you know, in the middle of the Me Too movement in Seattle, Washington, right? And I made them all write about their ideas and really drove my points home. And they were really good. They were really good sports. They dutifully participated, but for every student that really appreciated what I was doing, there was another who kind of resented it. To be honest, they wanted to be dancing. They didn't want to be sitting down filling out a worksheet, right? They wanted to be working on their technique. This was technique class. They wanted to be getting stronger and flexible and learning more fierce moves, right? Not like learning variations and pondering ad nauseum all the different ways to, you know, flap your arms like a swan, you know. So perhaps despite themselves, I did see their technique improve, which made me feel like I at least still did my job, and they were certainly more interesting to watch. But I don't think they really got the process I was trying to get them to engage in. And in reflecting on it, my attempt to facilitate this kind of embodied critical thinking ended up actually disconnecting some of my students from their work, rather than more deeply connecting them to that how and the why, which was my whole point of doing it. So in reflecting on it, I think that the point I missed is that critical thinking really has to start from this point of engagement and curiosity from the student. It has to start from their hunger to solve the problem, not from a point of frustration or from a point of obligation or requirement. So also my point starting out with this project is that the dancing is the thinking. It's not something extra that we have to do. It isn't thinking, again, about dancing. It's thinking by dancing. It's thinking in the action of doing it itself. And I found a great quote from Bell Hooks, who wrote a whole book about critical thinking, or about teaching critical thinking, it's called. And she says that the heartbeat of critical thinking is the longing to know, to understand how life works. And I would translate that into saying that thinking, the heartbeat of thinking is also in that longing. It's in that curiosity that arises from the dancer, not from some exercise imposed on the outside. And so in my desire to kind of give them that experience of critical thinking, I kind of thwarted my own aim. Squashed it a little bit. So it took me to sort of a new way of thinking about this fruitful place where dance and movement and somatics and pedagogy are meeting. So I'm just going to offer a few thoughts for kind of where I could see this going next. One is that we could use somatics as a way into this kind of indirect pedagogy. Yeah, so how do we, rather than going right for it, how do we create the conditions out of which we know what we want will arise? And I think somatics offers a really nice framework for this. It's very much concerned with the condition, creating the right conditions out of which what we want to happen will kind of naturally arise. And it reminds me of a lot of the developmental movement work that I've studied that talks about how we learn to move and how we learn, and that we learn to move and we learn to learn by being curious about the world. And that curiosity is something that, in theory, we come into the world with. And I think this is really the seed of critical thinking, is this kind of curiosity. Bell Hooks says, across the boundaries of race, class, gender, and circumstance, children come into the world of wonder and of language, and I would say also of movement, consumed with a desire for knowledge. And I think we see this certainly in kids we teach dance to, right? Sometimes they're so eager for knowledge that they become relentless interrogators, demanding to know who, what, when, how does it all work, right? And searching for answers, they learn almost instinctively how to think. So the thinking arises out of the curiosity. So from a pedagogical standpoint, that's really interesting to me, right? So how do we create the conditions for our students in our classrooms out of which this natural curiosity can be nurtured and tended to, both for ourselves as teachers, right, and for our students. The other thing involved, oh, and I can move this, the big reveal, right? Yeah, okay, so curiosity. So the other thing about teaching through this sort of indirect pedagogy, or thinking more about the conditions for learning rather than the delivery of the content itself, is a practice of learning to trust the process and trusting that these conditions are enough for the learning to arise, which I think is a hard thing for teachers to learn, especially in the context of a technique class where we really do want technical skill to be advanced, and right. So trusting that it will arise, I think, is hard, and I think that's another link with somatics, right? That somatics very much offer a process-based way of working, where engaging with the process is the point, and out of the process the desired result arises. So this is another exciting connection, I think. And I really do believe that good technique can arise out of this kind of teaching and learning, out of curiosity and out of inquiry-based environments. I do believe that technical excellence and skill can still arise. So, two more things. One is that another interesting observation, I mentioned that I did these same projects with the 100 and the 200 level, and that the 100 level was much more open and receptive and interested in what I was doing. So I think this is really interesting to think about in terms of where this could go. Thinking about the relationship between one's skill level and kind of maybe one's educational aims or even one's professional aims, and openness to new ways of working. So I think there's something interesting there. And then finally, just to kind of go back to where we started with what is critical thinking anyway, and how do we know it's happening, right? And especially if we're talking about it as being this kind of internal, personal experience, do we see it happening on the outside? And if we do in a dance context, what does it look like? What does that look like in the body? And is it important to know that it's happening, right? Is it important for our students to know that they're critically thinking? Like I was so determined to make them know. Or maybe it's not. And maybe that by kind of holding dance to this standard of critical thinking that kind of comes from other disciplines, where in a way maybe not honoring what dance does really intrinsically well on its own, this kind of thinking that might not need the language of critical thinking layered on top of it to make it valuable or to make it important to be doing. So those are kind of my thoughts, and I don't want to keep you any longer. It's 10 o'clock. But know that I'm here all weekend. I'd love to talk to you more. I've got cards here. And I really, really thank you all for being here.
Yeah.